Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
So far what we have been talking about is the way the economic growth or economic development, whatever you call it, is always linked with social concerns. And I was trying to argue here in this phase that the government had to take care of social objectives because at the time of independence, we inherited an economy which was very feeble, and we inherited a country which was poor, and something drastic needed to be done in order to ensure that poverty is eradicated and that there is greater justice. After all, you should know that our constitution gave emphasis to equality, fraternity and social justice. So, and of course, there was this emphasis on democracy. It can also, I should also mention here, in 1976, we decided to include the term socialism and secularism in the preamble of the constitution. So that for the future generations, the direction in which the state would go is very clear. Now, in this second phase of this, now pursuing the same theme further of the social objectives that have shaped the state's policy regarding development, we tried to show that the very policy of the very social objectives the government projected, the way in which these objectives were articulated kept changing with as democratic institutions took root in our country, and as we became more and more of a participative democracy, there were pressures from different segments of the population, and in order to meet these pressures, the state had to modify its objectives, even though it remained committed to the idea of equality and the eradication of poverty. Especially, when I am talking about poverty, eradication of poverty, when I am talking about eradication of poverty on the one hand and development on the other, or growth on the other, I should mention here that development can bring about a reduction in poverty. It can reduce poverty, all right, but there is no guarantee, all right. Development would reduce poverty. Development is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for reduction of poverty, all right. It also depends on the model of development, on the strategy of development that the government adopts. In regard to poverty, in regard to the eradication of poverty. I also want to introduce here that this strategy is also linked to the idea of inequality. All right. And inequality is again related to poverty, the extent of poverty in the country, right. But it is possible if you can attend to you can attend to poverty and yet retain inequalities as it is. I will give you an example. For instance, it's like you are all going in a boat, all right. All of a sudden, this is the river, let us say. We are all going in a boat, in boats. One is a large boat, all right. There is a tiny boat also. There are small boats also, all right. You see, this analogy of the river is important. Now, if in these boats, there are small ones and large ones. They are all going down the river. Supposing there is, a rush of water, then the level of the water increases. All right, all the boats are lifted up. All right, if all the boats are lifted up, the small boat remains small, and the middle boat remains middle, and the big boat continues to be big. So, this is one way of development when every everyone is lifted, and poverty is also those people who are below the poverty line are also lifted up, but the degree of inequality, the kind of inequality that obtained continues, all right. But usually in economists say that with economic development, poverty will reduce. Poverty will reduce with economic development. And it depends on the model of development you have. If you have a free competition in the market, what happens to the what happens when there is free competition? Then those in the market is such that it rewards those who succeed, who make more and more profits, all right. And those who do not make profit, who make losses, they have to, if there are 10 people who have invested in a particular project, and one of them is very smart and is able to reduce the cost of his production, and he is able to outperform or outsell his competitors, all the competitors have to close their shops and go home, and he becomes rich, all right. But the argument is that if a number of investors come up, all right, and if they become rich, what will the rich people do? They will start spending money, and gradually when they start spending money, the money reaches the poor. They need servants, they need gardeners, they need dhobis, they need health of doctors, engineers and so on. So, the money, and then skilled workers, masons and so on. So, the money will come down. This is called the trickle down effect of free competition, all right. So, ultimately poverty will be removed, and ultimately there will be general prosperity, and it is argued, looking at European countries, what happens is that it will be a diamond shaped society with a large middle class, and the rich will be few in number, the poor will be small in number, and the big belly will consist of the middle class. all right. So, this will be the pattern of development that will occur, all right. But in our country, we did not place, we did not have much faith in this approach to development. In fact, the leading industrialists, there are a few leading industrialists in our country, those who had invested in cotton textiles and in jute mills. Of course, the Tatas were exceptional. They had set up a steel mill in our country, all right. There were a few industrialists, and in 1944, they came up with a plan called the Bombay Plan, all right. They recommended, they knew that independence is about to, India is about to attain independence, and therefore they worked out a plan. They worked out a plan to advise the future independent government what to do. And in that, these were, mind you, these were private industrialists. But even these private industrialists, what they said was, we need the role of the state. We need the state to, build, the steel mills, produce coal, to build coal mines, to build heavy industries. We need roads, we need more railways, and therefore the state is very much, necessary for us to develop. So, this was the idea that was right from the beginning. Even our industrialists, who should normally be against, who should be for free enterprise and free competition, all right. Of course, there was a forum for free enterprise that was created by the Tatas. That is another story. But what they wanted was, they wanted free enterprise, but the state should invest in these, infrastructure, what is called infrastructure projects, like in public utilities, production of electricity, production, roads, railways, mines, and so on, steel and other things, which where the, it will not be it will not be, they are all not profitable investments, and they are investments that will mature over a long period of time. Therefore, it is argued that the state should play a major dominant role in economic affairs. So, in a way, the country was inclined towards socialist ideas, even before independence, right. The idea was that it was inclined towards socialist ideas, although there were a few Gandhians and others who thought that there is agriculture in which you can never have public enterprise. But all said and done, there was a general feeling that the state should play a dominant role in promoting economic development. Now, there is another reason for the socialist orientation in our society right from the beginning. That was the issue of social inequalities. By the way, I have to define what is economic inequality. I'll explain that very quickly before I go on to talk about social inequalities. Economic inequality is that if a country's national income is divided, let's say we have a country about 1,000 people, and if now in income inequality is when there are a few people at the top let us say 10% of the people earn per month about 5 lakhs of rupees, and there are 90% of the people who earn per month, each one of them earn per month just hardly 10,000 rupees per month, all right. Then there is a big gap, all right. Now, if you see the basic income in a government organization is about, let us say, 20,000 rupees per month, all right. Now, if there are officers who are earning about 2 lakhs per month, 2 lakhs per month. So, the officers get 10 times the salary of the lowest. That means there is a big disparity in income level. And similarly, if the income disparity, if income inequality is, if there are fewer rich people earning more money, earning a larger share of the national income, and a large number of poor people who are earning a smaller share of the national income, then there is inequality. Now, there are measures to, there are economists have evolved measures to calculate the extent of inequality. I don't want to, they use a measure to find out to what extent there is inequality of incomes in the country. I don't want to go into that, but it's possible to find out whether a country is getting to be more equal or less equal, or its inequalities are increasing. Now, as I had mentioned in another lecture, what is happening is that the proportion of the rich, the inequality between the rich and the poor is increasing, and the top 1% of the people are amassing more than 50% of the national income, it said. So, there is more and more inequalities. According to the latest figures, 73% of the national income is owned by the top 1% of the population. So, that means the remaining 99% of the population get only 27% of the national income. This is very sharp inequality. Now, the point is that if you reduce inequality, if you reduce poverty, if you increase the level of income of the poor, then it's not necessary that it also leads to reduction of inequalities, because the rich, when the poor come from one stage to the next, they may go this high, but the rich who are here may go further up, in which case inequalities may spread. So, the government is interested in in the issue of inequality, and especially our Indian state has been concerned about the issue of inequality. For one reason, because inequalities will also produce social tensions and social conflict. But more importantly, in India, more than economic inequality, social inequalities or inequalities are become very crucial. What is social inequality? Dr. Ambedkar talked about social inequalities. He gave more importance to social inequality than economic inequality. Although some people say that once economic inequalities are abolished, there will be no social inequality. Ambedkar doesn't subscribe to that notion. He said that social inequalities are important in themselves. What is social inequality? Social inequality is differentiation of social status. You are, when Dr. Ambedkar, when the Constituent Assembly accepted the Constitution of India, Dr. Ambedkar said, we are a nation, we have now entered a phase where, one person has one vote, all right, one person has one vote, but that is far from a stage where one person has one value, all people have equal value. He is emphasized the fact, especially the Dalits, especially the former untouchables, they do not have enough social, they do not enjoy any, social status. They have a low social status in the society. They are discriminated against, and because of they are discriminated against, they are denied the opportunities to educate themselves, and they do not have the resources. They are dependent. They are oppressed by the, by the other castes, who use traditional caste, duties and caste rituals to, exclude them from the benefits that they enjoy, and so on. Therefore, Dr. Ambedkar said that social inequality is important, and that is why he introduced the notion of reservations for the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. These scheduled castes and scheduled tribes refer to the schedule in the Constitution which lists the number of the castes who are supposed to have suffered from untouchability and other forms of oppression, and tribes are those who are backward and who are isolated from the mainstream of the population. He considered that they should be given representation in legislatures, and then subsequently this representation in legislatures were, our Constitution was amended to include reservations of seats in government and in seats in educational institutions and so on. So, Ambedkar was the person who introduced the idea of promoting social equality by privileging certain underprivileged sections of society, especially the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Now, this Ambedkar emphasized on this because he said that when people, are able to come into the parliament and debate and discuss national issues, and when they get opportunities for education and all that, their social status will improve, and there will then be a semblance of equality. All right? Then they will have the confidence required to act as free citizens of a democratic country. This was his idea. But in the phase of socialist society phase, the emphasis was, the Nehru believed that once development takes place, we will be moving towards a casteless and classless society, especially when development especially when development is of a socialist society, socialist pattern, is of a socialist nature. If this model of development is socialist, then we will ensure that there are no differences in class, and differences in, and castes will be wither away. Caste practices will disappear. This was his idea. So, in the beginning till 1980s, till 1977, I should say, the emphasis of the government of the state in India was more towards promoting economic equality, in the sense that once economic inequality is, comes about, all these castes and other notions will disappear. That did not happen. I'll have to discuss why. But anyway, this takes us to the idea of socialist pattern of society. All right. What I propose to do here, I'll discuss, of course, briefly the idea of socialist pattern of society, and I will go on to talk about how the fact that the socialist pattern of society did not, was not very effective, this strategy was not very effective. The state came up, there was a lot of social stirrings, and what actually became important is the idea of social justice, all right, which emphasized the idea of attending to social inequalities rather than economic inequalities alone. They said that it will be important to do something in order to promote true social justice. You will have to attend to this problem of social inequalities more than the problem of economic inequality. And from here, I will go on to talk about how this emphasis on social justice and social inequalities also led to several counter effects, was counterproductive. What I am trying to argue here is that the more you emphasize on equality, the more equality became unattainable. In fact, there is one can argue that more and more you talked about equality, more and more you ensured that there will be, poverty will continue to, bother our economy. As I mentioned, I want to mention here that you all know that the level of poverty in our country is acute, especially of those who are poor, because of the fact that the Human Development Index, our progress in terms of providing health care, education, primary school education, and other things are lagging, but providing basic amenities for the people are lagging behind. In fact, we are lagging behind as the most of the even nations which are not as rich as ours. So there is this, the problem is that our counter poverty, counter social or measures to counter social inequalities and economic inequalities have not really produced the desired results. Instead, they produce a system which generates inequalities, which keeps inequalities growing, which keeps social inequalities also growing at the same time. That is the second point I will make. The third point I will make is in regard to the problems that inequalities, the idea of closing in the inequality gaps, both in terms of social status and in terms of economic status, the kinds of contradictions they have produced, I will talk about it. Now, the socialist pattern of society, the basic thing is that the socialist pattern of society emphasized rapid industrialization. This was in the Nehruvian times. Rapid industry, they said that if the country rapidly advances, if it if by having number of large industries, which are basic industries, steel, iron and steel, mines, coal mines and machine, machine tools industries and so on. What will happen is that we will build the potential for other industries which are dependent on machine tools, which are dependent on iron and steel. They will all be growing, and then we will become, the country will become self-sufficient in basic industries. Therefore, other industries which depend on them will also start expanding, rapidly growing, and industrialization will occur, and rapid industrialization will occur. Then people will start moving from agriculture to industry, and rural areas, villages will, there will be migration from villages to urban areas, cities and towns, and pressure on for population on the villages will come down, as a result of which agriculture, which is, most of in our country, agriculture suffers, has low yields because of the fact that there is, it's argued that there are too many people on the land, so therefore we cannot and then the land is all parceled out into small bits, most of the land. Because of that, you cannot invest in heavy machinery, you cannot invest in modern methods of agriculture. Because of that, agriculture is suffering. Now when there is urbanization, rapid urbanization, because of industrialization, agriculture will also have less, fewer people depending on it. Therefore, agriculture will also grow, agricultural yields will also grow, and there will be general development. This was the strategy of socialist planning. Unfortunately, this strategy did not work, did not succeed. Of course, there was the government, also concentrated, also spent some energy on the agricultural sector, in the sense that they introduced land reforms to abolish absentee landlordism, zamindari and so on. But while the abolition of zamindari, was a very, I think we should regard it as a success, because it brought in the former tenants became landowners, and it, a new crop of small, agriculturalists came up who were interested in, in increasing agricultural yields. And in fact, as I will point out subsequently, this was a very crucial turning point in our development history. So this model of socialist development did not prove to be effective, because soon afterwards, after there was 1962 Chinese aggression, and in 1965 we had a confrontation with Pakistan, and there was food shortage. The socialist pattern of society, was based on planning. That is, there is a central planning commission which ensured that industries, only all the big industries should be in the hands of the government, and that other industrial units should be under the control of the government. There is no point in wasting your resources by allowing competition and having 10 sugar mills come up in an area where there is only a need for 2 sugar mills. So they say, the government started issuing licenses. Only 2 sugar mills can come up in one particular area, not 10 sugar mills. All right. They started controlling who can invest and who cannot, and they controlled this. The socialist planning resulted in what Mr. C. Rajagopalachari said as the license, permit, Raj, license, permit, Raj, because for every, to invest in any particular industrial unit, you needed to get the clearance of the government, and in order to get raw materials from abroad, or in order to critical raw materials from abroad, you need permits from the government. In fact, that's the reason why it's argued that the idea was good, to conserve our national resources and channel these national resources into particular industries, but it did not work that way. It created this license permit Raj, and in agriculture the government's policy did not prove effective. We soon had a food crisis, and we had to, in the 1960s, we had to, there was a system of PL 480, all right, Public Law 480, that was an American law. The American law was to, according to the American law, the excess food that America grows can be sent abroad to countries which were in short of food grains. All right, you can imagine, because of food grain shortage, we had to import wheat from America. In fact, in 1965, the then Prime Minister, he was only a Prime Minister for a short period, Mr. Lal Bahadur Shastri, who was the Prime Minister of the country, he not only gave the slogan Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan, he also introduced a non-cereal day. One day of the week, was a non-cereal day, when cereals were not used in public, public eating places. The idea was to conserve our availability of food grains, and this was also they also prohibited lavish expenses in marriages, weddings. They wanted to make sure that the number of guests are limited, and food is conserved. This was the idea at that time, because this means that the expected land reforms did not result in increasing productivity. This is also because of the fact that our technology in agriculture was, till then we thought that we can only increase yields if we combine all these small plots together in the form of cooperative societies, and get them to enjoy the benefits. If you have large plots of land, if you grow food on large parts of land, you can use tractors, you can use harvest combiners and others, and therefore you can increase the you can use for modern methods of agriculture, and you can increase yield. This was the idea, and actually it did not happen. That's also partly because the landless remained landless. The land reforms policy, while it succeeded in eliminating absentee landowners and zamindars, all right, it was not effective in implementing ceilings on land holding, land holdings of big landowners. So, as a consequence of which, the landless did not get adequate land. The idea was the land that was above the ceiling will be distributed among the poor. That did not happen. Among the landless, that did not happen. So, as a consequence, agricultural yield was stagnant. Actually, it was, I think, again the initiative of the then Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri, that India adopted this technology, this high yielding varieties, agricultural technology, all right, which was introduced which had just then been innovated. These high yielding varieties of crops, made sure that plant scientists discovered in their laboratories, they bred cross pollinated plants, especially wheat. They started with wheat. They cross pollinated different wheat plants to make sure that the longer that the plants were short in stature, they did not grow big, they did not grow tall. When they don't grow tall, all the nutrition that they absorb from the soil will all go into the formation of seeds, that is food grains, and they crossed the through genetic means, they crossed the the high yielding, they produce high yielding varieties through a process of cross pollination, and produced these these high yielding varieties promised to double agricultural yields per acre. Not only that, these high yielding varieties of agriculture, this entire packet of technology was called the Green Revolution technology. What happened was, along with these high yielding varieties, you had to use these high yielding varieties required enormous amount of water and fertilizers, all right, chemical fertilizers, all right. This was an entire package, but these high yielding varieties did not require large plots of land. It was intensive agriculture. So, even on small plots of land, one can get high yields. So, the government adopted these high yielding varieties of crops and transformed the agricultural scenario to such an extent that India became self-sufficient in food, especially in wheat, very quickly, all right. But the consequences of this, environmentalists say that the consequences of this green revolution have been disastrous for a variety of reasons, because the soil fertility has gone down. They say that apart from soil fertility going down, there has been environmental pollution, groundwater has been polluted with all kinds of with mercury, with lead and so on, and it has led to extensive environmental damage, and more than that, it has the farmers' traditional agricultural knowledge, they all became obsolete, and the farmers, the agricultural knowledge of agricultural practices, the varieties of agricultural, the varieties of crops they grew. You see, earlier in traditional agriculture, that system that sustained a particular social ecology which was conducive to the local environment, all right. So much so that there were numerous varieties of crops, the variety of crop changed from one village to another. So, as a result, it was possible that if there is if there is some infestation in one part of the country, if some crops are are affected adversely, in the other crops which are not affected by those insects, we will flourish. But the knowledge of agriculture, that the Indian farmers, traditional knowledge of agriculture that the Indian farmers possessed, and also knowledge of drought resistant crops that they had, and knowledge of using economically the resources they had, and using and ensuring that not just food grains they produce, they also produce enough of nutrition in the form of milk by keeping cows, by keeping milk cattle and so on. There is a whole rhythm of agriculture, of rural life that was destroyed because of green revolution. I will talk about this when I start talking about, when I come to the topic of agriculture. But what is important here for us to note is that socialist pattern of society had its first jolt when agricultural production did not increase and industrial growth did not, it was expected that industrial growth under the planning with the state becoming the main the not only director, also makes sure that it opens up numerous controls and operates large industries, and therefore it gets the profit which it can distribute to the society. That was the idea of distributive justice, so that poverty is those under poverty will be will have a better standard of life. There will be surplus available. That did not materialize because the public sector plants were there are several instances to show that public sector plants did not work very efficiently. They were not because they were not profit oriented. They started producing enormous losses, and the control over private industries made sure that only the people who can influence government officials to grant them licenses were able to make windfall profit, not by producing anything, but by just having these licenses. You see, one particular instance comes to mind, that there was one big I do not want to mention the name of the big industrialist, that one of the big industrial houses that has emerged today in the country owes its origin to the fact that it used the quota and quota and license system to its advantage. Simply put, what this company did was, it started exporting its products abroad at a lower rate than the rate it started exporting its products, even though the price at the cost of its production was much higher than the cost of production of companies outside the country. Yet it started exporting these things, even though it made loss. If your cost of production is higher than the price at which you sell in the foreign market, naturally you will be making losses. But it continued to make these huge losses. You know why? Because by showing that it exported these so much, it was entitled to get licenses to import precious precious metals and valuable items that were needed by industries. So once it got the license, it did not have to use the license to produce things in the in the country, instead of which it can just sell the license to people who are wanting these licenses at a big profit, and it did not really have to produce it did not really have to use these licenses to produce. In fact, the system of quotas and licenses encouraged many industrial units to have a large capacity, huge capacity, because if they have huge capacity, they will get licenses for import of large amount of materials, and then not use the entire capacity and sell off the license for they use only one portion of the capacity that they have built, and the license for full operation, licenses for import of raw materials that are required, machine parts and other things that are required, can be sold off to others who will pay, more than double the amount that they would have got by actually using these licenses to produce. So, it produced a kind of a monopolistic regime, this license and quota Raj, it produced a monopolistic kind of regime which restricted output. So, socialist pattern of society, what they say, produced a rentier economy. There were people who were interested in earning unearned income, windfalls, without actually contributing to production. Socialist pattern of society, did not really help in increasing agricultural yields, although after, but when I should mention here that socialist pattern of society did not make any impact on radical impact on agriculture, except in the case of land reforms which produced a class of independent tenants who became independent cultivators. I will stop here.